Thank you so much for that introduction. I really mean it is just a terrific honor to be here, and I thank Abigail and the center for having me. I'm humbled by what I've heard, and I've been scribbling and changing in response to it. It's so powerful. So the new feminism is so much a part of my professional and personal life and spiritual life for 30 years that I really struggled to separate it out and hold it up for inspection here. I even thought of naming this paper Reflections and Thoughts of a New Feminist Lab Rat, because that's what I was. It and me came up together. But inspected I did, and I concluded, and we'll unpack here, that I think that, like so many other really good things Christianity brought to humanity, it got started as a genuinely radical idea, challenging prevailing norms from the moment it appeared, but then got somewhat tamed and reduced through a combination of our laziness, sinfulness, and limited imagination and will, but needs to be reappropriated in a more true to original form. The radical idea, of course, is that females image God in a way that men don't exactly, and that Jesus' Great Commission incorporates this. From this, we can take that any advocacy for women's freedom should be centrally concerned to allow women to operate wherever God wants what we have, and however we have been asked to bear Christ into the world. In other words, a Christian feminism is not primarily about us, it's about Him. This is the opposite of bad autonomy, yet it requires a woman to be strong and courageous in order to take responsibility for the tasks that come with her gifts. It's the opposite of man hating, but it requires men and women alike not to hinder God's will for women, whether through men's dominating or women's conniving in her own subjection. And it's the opposite of a culture of death, because, of course, one of women's indisputable gifts to share is her capacity for vulnerable life. New Feminism 1.0 never really lost sight of this, but spent what I would call a disproportionate amount of time, for understandable reasons I'll discuss, thinking about what this world justice looks like for women. So I think that if we breathe new life into the Great Commission begun in Genesis, then a new Feminism 2.0 will be truer to God's will for us and assist some of the dilemmas that 1.0 left standing. I'm going to explore this by brief discussion first of the way Christian innovations often unfold over time, then apply this to the new feminism. This will include criminally brief discussions of scripture and early Christianity, and then a more full consideration of the later 20th century. Finally, I'll offer a few thoughts about how a recovery of the original radical idea might assist some of the dilemmas lingering after New Feminism 1.0. So, no news to this group, and I am repeating some of the things that have been said before, but hey, it's Friday. Christianity often proceeds by way of mind-blowing divine revelations, clearly flying in the teeth of custom and culture from their first utterance, that are only over time more deeply lived out and understood. Think about how long it's taking us still to unpack the revelation that God accomplishes our salvation by dying in a ghastly, shameful manner, and then is resurrected 3 days later. And I think Angela Franks noted this in her first talk. Think about the Christian insight about slavery, begun really in the Genesis account, and then followed by St. Paul's admonition that there's neither slave nor free person. Why? Because, as he says in his instruction to Philemon, please receive your runaway slave Onesimus, now a convert. Receive him because he's no longer a slave, but a brother. Why? Because he's a brother in the Lord. Now, the radical implications of this were not fully realized in the Christian milieu for centuries, but the flame did grow in the appearance of some anti-slavery Christian theology soon after the decline of Rome, to the work of Christian abolitionists in Europe and the United States. And eventually, you may recall, I think John Paul II made a total of 5 apologies for Christianity's role in slavery. I reference these examples of the unfolding of Christian innovations over time because I think that the Church's treatment of women's equal dignity and feminine genius have proceeded likewise, with the recovery of the radical form still to be realized. Regarding women, of course, the radical foundational Christian conclusion about women's dignity and equality comes from Genesis teaching that women, like men, are created in God's image and likeness. The image and likeness phrase, if we had like a nickel for every time it's been used this week, we'd be wealthy. This is, as John Paul II never tired reminding us, both a gift and a task. Accordingly, when women's God-given gifts are not acknowledged, when we're even hindered from our part in bearing God to the world with our particular gifts, this is injustice. So the highest task of a Christian or new feminism, of a movement concerning the difficulties and injustices that women disproportionately face, is to overcome what constrains women from this vocation. And of course, Christian feminism is on full display in the New Testament, in the words and actions of Jesus and his apostles. As John Paul II points out, God chooses a woman with whom to initiate his new covenant, literally to bear God into the world. And in Jesus' interactions with women, transcending cultural norms and highlighting women's capacity to receive and reveal divine wisdom, like you are the Christ, right? Then, beginning in early Christianity and persisting to today, the implications of God's will to women have unfolded, beginning with the Christian community's upending social norms, holding that a woman's status is at best derivative of a human man's, as in she is his mother, daughter, or wife. But bringing to life St. Paul's admonition that there is neither man nor woman, and this has been pointed out before, I am in the only group in the United States that collectively thinks that women being able to become martyrs was like a sign of our progress, right? But we know it is, right? Christianity called women to valor in relationship to Christ. Martyrs, saints, celibates for the sake of the kingdom, early philanthropists to the Christian movement, and over time, theological scholars, founders of religious orders, mystics, and women all over the world consecrating the world to Christ by way of work in all the fields to which he called them. Now let's fast forward to the last 3/4 of a century, during a time that I think we can say we've seen a cascade of attention by the church and by women leaders in the church to the question of women's vocations. Before I talk about the contents of this, let me say generally, while these materials always strenuously affirmed the radical idea that got it all started, they also spent a lot of time dealing with this worldly oppression of women, including in church arenas, okay? With an eye to the time frame of those materials, I have theories as to why New Feminism 1.0 did so much of this. There was a growing perception at these times that the society of the church and the society of the world were foreign to one another, that the church was an ancient, hidebound, celibate male institution, while secular society, I mean, I grew up in the late 60s, the 70s, and 80s. It was almost tangible what I described, that we were conscious of new ideas, of people on the other side of the world, new technologies, previously less visible and oppressed members of society, and especially following World War II, as Marianne Glendon has so brilliantly documented, of fundamental human rights, okay? And we had all that going on, and what's going on with the church? So it seems to me that the church was responding as if to say, we affirm all that is true and good regarding recognition of human rights. We're not afraid of the world. We're not enemies of science and reason. We're actually their best friends. And the church hadn't previously spoken much in her universal documents about women except regarding motherhood. So it had a lot more that needed to be said. And more Catholic women, myself included, who were writing about the new feminism, wanted to assure observers, echoing St. Paul, that whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is worthy of praise, in movements for women's freedom, could find a friend in Christ and in his church. And then to show how these true, just, honorable, praiseworthy elements of the women's movement pointed at the same time to the necessity of respecting unborn life, to the work of wrenching, and I use that term with all of its connotations because it's hard, wrenching society and the economy and the law to the highest respect for motherhood and family life while supporting women in every sphere. So what do these documents of many popes during this time do, in addition to affirming women's beautiful call to motherhood? They recount women's oppression and affirm the movements agitating for women's dignity and equality. John the 23rd's Pacem in Terris affirms women's, quote, demanding both in domestic and public life the rights and duties which belong to them as human persons. Gaudium et Spes blesses women's working in, quote, all spheres, saying, quote, it is fitting they are able to assume their proper role in accordance with their nature. And of course, John Paul II's Mulieris Dignitatem. It does so many things. It condemns discrimination against women, expresses compassion for single mothers and the post-aborted, insists on greater access to education for girls. In his letter to women, after affirming the movement for women was substantially positive, he lauds women's often unheralded roles in political, economic, and social spheres, calls for equal pay, for protections for working mothers, for their career advancements, for equality between spouses, commits Catholic education to a priority strategy for women. I remember having so much fun with that. It was me versus Al Gore and Tim Wirth on television during those UN conferences about women. And I was like, how come you have figured out how much it costs to contracept every woman in the developing world, but you haven't got a figure for how much it costs to educate them? What's wrong with you? You know, it was, I remember I was at a panel with Tim Russert, the late Tim Russert, who was such a fun, wild television commentator. And he referred to the Holy See at those conferences as, quote, eating the lunch of the US, right? Because we were talking about the whole life of women, okay? John Paul II also apologizes for any role the church played in the historical oppression of women. And of course, all these themes were continued in the work of Joseph Ratzinger, then at the CDF, and later as Pope Benedict. And Pope Francis has been particularly vocal about supporting women in more leadership roles within the church, in his synodal processes, curial offices, Vatican museums, Office of Communications, Council on the Economy, where women are in the majority among the lay positions. And while, of course, in all of these documents and actions, the church has recognized wrong turns and bad anthropology and ignorance of God that led some strands of feminism to valorize and equate with women's progress things like rabid individualism, the lifestyles of badly behaved men, abortion, and the divorce of sex from marriage from kids. Now, I don't want to give the impression these leading teachings on women from the church neglected the radical centerpiece of the new feminism, women's gift and task of imaging God in the world. The letter to women, in fact, at one point thanks women simply for being women, for receiving what God has sent and doing the work that God has entrusted them to do. And nearly all of these documents, while taking care not to fall into stereotypes or psychological or biological reductionism, sensitively highlights some aspects of the female vocation that seem to stand the test of time and global differences, most especially women's capacity for the other, her physical, emotional, intellectual, and spiritual motherhood, her defense of vulnerable life, and her tendency to elevate human beings over ideologies and systems. Believe me, I thought about every line I did in light of the papers that have come before, that one in particular in light of the panel yesterday on complementarity. Now, having lived my entire adult career, 40 years and counting, under the influence of these documents, I can attest that their affirmations were very inspiring, reassuring, and even illuminating of the situations I found myself in. I traveled 120 days a year for the bishops until I had kids. So I was out there all the time. For example, I remember co-hosting a radio program with a bishop, and a post-aborted woman called in. At different points in our interaction, it was clear that only a priest would do. She needed to speak to a priest. But at other points, only a woman who had raised children and lost them too, in my case, to several miscarriages. And in my academic and public life, a new feminist mindset informed so much, really everything. It informed my writing family law books and articles from the perspective of society's responsibility to the vulnerable and to families. It informed my showing the young women I taught, and frankly, every week I get a call from some young woman I don't know. And I talk to them. I'd rather go there than a faculty meeting. Just kidding, right? And I go and I say, yes, those are the calls I never say no to, right? They want to know, is it possible to put your higher education at the service of the church and have that gift received? Is it possible to be pro-life, not in spite of your fancy degree, but because of it? And when the Bishops' Conference that I was working for, when their administration didn't want to let me work from home after becoming a mother to my daughter here, a new feminist mindset emboldened me to threaten to quit immediately. By the way, I also threatened to put out a press release. But anyway, it emboldened me to threaten to quit, to mean it, and to win. Okay? And I remember after my husband Brian died several years ago, and I was having dinner with his wonderful childhood friends, and I told them Brian would write me every year in a Valentine's card, every year for the 37 years we were married and he was with me. He would write something that said, I would have been dead by now without you. And I took it as part of his crazy sense of humor. But to a man and woman, they jumped. Oh, no, Helen, he would totally have been dead if you hadn't married him. He was crazy. And he was. He lived as long as he did because you loved him so long, they said, and you made him a father. And I thought, what only a woman could do. It was that. It was being a woman, his wife, in his life, it being a mother. But I think the instructions that I imbibed too much from the new feminism, here's where the confession part of my title comes in, were too often in line with its attention to assuring women their this world share of goods, like men had. For me, that meant a career previously little populated by women, check. An Ivy League law degree, check. A big firm first job, check. And then a position in a seemingly male-led institution, the church, check. I remember how proud I was when, after being appointed the public face of all the U.S. bishops, I was asked to lecture at one of their televised masses. I was wearing a red suit. It was the 90s, please excuse it. It was fully red. And I said to my father, "Dad, did you see me on TV? Did you see me? I was the one in red on the altar." And he replied, "Helen, you were the only person with legs on the altar. I totally saw you." Okay. And I ate it up. I remember my absolute delight at being asked to go higher, to attend meetings and serve on councils at the Holy See. I attended a small audience with John Paul II in 1998 during a meeting about women, when the Pope, and his hands were shaking at this point, before turning to his written remarks, looks up at us, holds up his finger with a sly look in his eye, and he says, "I am the feminist Pope." And then he burst out laughing, and he threw his head back, and his shoulders are shaking, and then he picks up his papers again. Meanwhile, I gave birth to 3 children in 5 years, and I read the new feminism to require me to put family first, but also to maintain all my worldly accomplishments. After all, it was for the church, right? Or as my Brian used to ironically say, "You show them, Helen. Get up at 4:45 to write, go to bed late, get exhausted, paste yourself together with makeup and Tylenol. That is totally taking it to the man." Okay? Okay. And so, as you're guessing right about now, when I reflect back, I can see that even though I did some good for the church and the world and for the causes of women and children in the family, I got a lot wrong too. Here's more about my examination of conscience in public. I didn't stop nearly enough to ponder thoroughly the central question of Christian feminism. Am I doing God's will? Am I doing what I'm supposed to do to bring Christ to the world? Am I first listening to the voice of God every day with humility, with true receptivity, accompanied by that active receiving, followed by the strength of will necessary to bring to completion what I hear? Am I willing to go where it leads, whether deeper into the needs of my family and friends, or out into the world where my talents meet particular needs, even if I'm tired, afraid, might be ridiculed? Am I fooling myself that I'm just attending to the particular work placed in my hands that no one else can do? My children, my spouse. Am I nourishing all the work given to me with prayer, with Mass, with quiet listening to God when I am not just running my mouth? Regarding the institutions I occupy, including particularly the church, am I mimicking stereotypical male standards or meekly acceding to rules and structures, even if they hinder God's will, if they hinder proper parenting, if they ride roughshod over loving human relations and consistent respect for life? Am I willing to go further and denounce abuse and unjust exclusions, whether concerning women or others? As I indicated before, although new feminism never lost sight of these central questions, it did spend a lot of time assuring observers the church could meet the world's standards for the good parts of secular feminism. But now that even the good parts of secular feminism and the new feminism together have been tried on the ground for some decades, it's clear there remain questions and dilemmas. And that even some of us new feminists sometimes forgot that it's not always just about us, it's first about him. So perhaps a return to a purer form of feminism, new feminism 2.0, might take us further along the right path. So let me consider this in my final piece here by highlighting some of the dilemmas still with us following 1.0 and think about how 2.0 might assist. First, is a new Christian feminism disparaging any work for mothers save work in the home? This seems a live debate today among new Christian feminists. I think the answer is clearly no, albeit, as I just suggested, the question of a mother's total vocation comes with a demand for an honest examination of conscience about whether justice is being done, first to those committed to her care as a spouse and mom, for which tasks there is no substitute person. John Paul II and Benedict and the Compendium of Catholic Social Teaching are clear. God's image and likeness in all its manifestations is required in every segment of society. Benedict is crystal clear about that in the Collaboration of Men and Women document. So I realized that more than a few times during my career that I really did have dual vocations. I have a vocation for public communications about the faith. I once appeared on this political food fight called Crossfire. At that time, it was Bill Press and Pat Buchanan. And I got a transcript because I thought what happened was the following. He would ask a question. Pat Ireland, head of NOW, would jump in and just keep talking. And I would go, and then Bill Press would cut me off. Then I'd go, and Bill Press would cut me off. I don't think I was ever flooded with so much mail from Catholic women telling them that what little I said made them proud to be Catholic. And I thought, when that output so much exceeds the input, that's the Holy Spirit's margin. That's my favorite vocational sign. Or there was a woman who approached me. It was actually a Sisters of Life dinner. It was in New York, to tell me she had been impacted by my now 10-year-old book chapter at that point. And I wrote it about my fear of having children and how I overcame it. She then said, well, you made a big impression. Here's my daughter, Maria. She's 9. Whoa, I thought, talk about your output exceeding your input. But then I had to face my responsibilities honestly when the Vatican asked me to travel weeks overseas for the UN negotiating team in Beijing, or Cardinal O'Connor asked me to be an official observer for a weeks-long synod in Rome, or the White House asked me to represent them at JP2's funeral during a weekend when my daughter, I'm glad I did the right thing, had an important event. No, no, and no, I answered, and I was not happy about no, no, and no. I hated it, but I knew it was the right thing to do. And I thought, this is why JP2 and Benedict have told us women that we have to make our way, to pray our way, to stumble our way through the days forward to the incarnation of a new Christian feminism. It is hard to sort. Our multiple vocations are real, but they conflict. God's will is not always apparent. I will tell you one story where I don't recommend this as spiritual direction or talking to God for anybody, but I always do too much. And I was helping a friend who's a single mom move. So I drove a big U-Haul van up to Philly. This is where God was very clear with me in a kind of brutal way. I drove this van up to Philadelphia. I moved her apartment and I drove a big empty U-Haul on the Beltway and a snowstorm came up. Now, the context of this is I had just agreed to be on the Holy See's negotiating team at the UN conference in Beijing, which is going to be weeks in China. Kate, I forget, you were like really young. I might have been pregnant with Julian. I can't remember. Anyway, I'm driving this van. A blizzard comes up and knocks me into a ditch. The van is tipping a ditch. It was a couple miles from my mother-in-law, who was not amused by my life. And, uh, and I had not had time to put on boots or a coat because I never did. So I am in loafers, no socks, and a jean jacket. And I walked 2 miles from that Beltway exit to her house. They were closer. And, she's thinking, I told you so, I told you so, I told you so. And I end up at their kitchen table, weeping, bubbling something about, I can't go to China for the Pope. I just can't. And she said, so I think God was so very clear with me that, Helen, you're doing too much. A couple of weeks ago, I had so much to do. I woke up and I couldn't feel my legs. And I was like, I think this is too much. You know what I mean? So, God is clear with me by physically knocking me off my perch, right? Next question. What about aiming for influential secular work that men have previously dominated? Again, we need to bear Christ into every arena, but not, of course, with an eye to mimicking, displacing, or trumping men. But if we do go to former male bastions, let's be honest, we have to be braver than we've been. Think of famous congresswomen. Women were going to change the whole way that business is done. Or corporate leaders who have not only done nothing to change the political or economic system so that they prioritize vulnerable people or families, but have become pro-abortion zealots. And I'll never forget, I was invited to a Washington welcome reception for a new pro-life congresswoman. And she stated, her opening remarks was that she had 2 children under 5, back home, far away, to come to DC without them in order to make a better world for her children. And I thought, maybe, but maybe no, right? Has a new Christian feminism failed if it influences women to spend more time at home or still disproportionately to occupy service jobs? Nope, not if that's the result of prayerful discernment of God's will, discerned from our talents, inclinations, and the needs of people in our orbit. Anybody here ever remember the SNL skit called The Cut? A bunch of women are hosting a baby shower and they tell the expectant mom who walks in with long blonde hair that she won't really be a mom unless she gets that short, spiky haircut they're all sporting. She protests. Until at one point, the hostess's teenage party meanders through, "Hi, Mom," and he's on his way to the kitchen, and he asks if dinner is in there. And the pregnant woman jumps up and she says, "I'll put it on a plate for you." And then she's like, "Oh my gosh, why am I offering to plate food for a perfectly able-bodied teen?" And then you look at her and she's got the cut. Okay? We're supposed to be horrified. But no, I think. Even SNL knows we have the urge to serve in this way. Do we need to spend a lot of time denouncing everything secular feminists got wrong? Do we need to ban the term? John Paul II and the women's UN teams he established didn't. The Pontifical Council for the Laity, now with the dicastery for sometimes I even forget the new title. Anyway, we don't forget that term. That's a term that we use and have really since the late 90s. And I wouldn't either. But I'm not wed to the term, just to the concept of diverting attention to women's special circumstances and needs. I also think, whatever we call it, that it's best not to look ungrateful for the good labors of secular feminists, who, after all, are our sisters in Christ, whether they know it or not. Remember the old Monty Python skit where the People's Front of Judea, as distinguished from the Judeans' People's Front and the front of the people of Judea, are complaining? What have the Romans ever done for us? And after members have mentioned things like all kinds of things, he says, sure, but aside from sanitation, medicine, education, wine, irrigation, roads, and fresh water, what have the Romans ever done for us, okay? Still, when speaking of a new feminism, a clear introductory statement will be needed to the effect that secular feminists are totally off base to denigrate the class of men, deny God, which is also to deny reality, and to valorize as progress, killing those vulnerable others we have been given precisely to protect. And to say that a new feminism will reach their nobler ends by nobler means. So finally, I think a new Christian feminism has to state clearly that even its earliest incarnation set its sights a little too low. The glass ceiling we need to break is not the floor of the C-suite or the top floor of the chancery, but the ceiling of every building in the world. The ceiling that separates the visible from the invisible. The ceiling that hides the divine sphere, which is to say, God's will, that every woman in the world is called to reveal to the world things about God that only she can. Thank you very much.
So it is my deep, really profound honor to be asked to respond to Helen's stunning keynote address to us at the end of this really incredible conference. My gratitude to Abigail for asking me and giving me this privilege to do so. So Helen and the great Marianne Glendon, two of the premier OG new feminists, have not only been inspiring mentors for me over the last 2 decades, and now I think I can say cherished friends, but as some of you here know, they both also played crucial roles in bringing me back to the church in the first place when I was in college. These two brilliant female scholars broke through all that I was wrestling with as a prayerful, Alcoholics Anonymous attending, left-wing women's studies student at Middlebury College in the mid-1990s. I wish I could go to the whole story, but I can't right now. That is to say that their new Catholic, or their new feminist witness, and the work of these two devout Catholic women alongside women in AA and many others gradually paved the way, built a bridge for the Holy Spirit to guide me back into the church that I was baptized as an infant. And the thing is, and we've heard some of the stories already, that I bet Helen and Marianne could recount hundreds and hundreds of women who have told them of this kind of profound influence in their lives. Marianne and Helen's moral clarity and what Helen this morning has called New Feminism 1.0 personally gave me the courage to put out into the deep, to begin to challenge and contest the rabidly pro-choice modern feminism that I and so many other young women had imbibed in the cultural drinking water, and never mind in our college classrooms. I think an apt description of Marianne can be applied to Helen too. She is a radical and a feminist, but not a radical feminist. My first 2 books, The Cost of Choice, Women Evaluate the Impact of Abortion, and Women, Sex, and the Church, A Case for Catholic Teaching, were works I accomplished in the margins of a busy family life at home with many small children. They were also a testament to all that I'd learned from the OG new feminists. And then, with more time for deep study as my children grew, I began to work out my arguments in the law journals where Marianne and Helen had been publishing for years and years. And so, for decades now, we JP2 inspired new feminists have contested modern feminism's abortion obsession and have done so in the very belly of the beast. In respected law journals and in academia, in New York Times, podcasts, and other left leaning news outlets, on network television at the UN, in Helen's case, regularly. For decades now, our work has offered scholarly guidance to grassroots advocates and lawyers and law classrooms and amicus briefs, and most notably, perhaps, where Helen and I, with the great Teresa Collette, brought our shared scholarship on behalf of more than 100 female scholars to the attention of the justices in the Dobbs case. And our brief was cited as they finally overturned the constitutional scourge that was Roe v. Wade. So we new feminists have argued in all these venues that the modern feminist obsession with abortion rights has betrayed women in its deep male normativity. As I've often put the point to the great consternation of our pro-choice interlocutors at places like Yale Law School. Indeed, in holding up abortion rights as the sine qua non, the modern feminism has not only makes women prey to the exploitation and commodification of their bodies, as Melissa explained so well yesterday, but an abortion-focused feminism has also encouraged women to ape vicious men's fallen tendency toward brutal domination of the weak. Such a feminism certainly imitates models of male domination, in the words of JP2 and Evangelium Vitae. And these arguments we've been making have had some real success, and not just in citations to the Supreme Court. It's no coincidence, I think, that some brilliant, progressive female journalists who have read us Catholics, not only us, but others like Mary Eberstadt too, are now crafting strong cases against the sexual revolution and are articulating a feminism against the progressive narrative. It's no coincidence that we are now seeing for the first time a real, if nascent, movement begin to rise up against modern feminism and its inhumane attempt to equalize the beautiful asymmetries between the sexes with reproductive technologies, beginning with the pill. And so with these new alliances and with Roe v. Wade gone, we have now before us more than ever before a real opportunity, I think, to transform culture so that it supports life, as John Paul the Great envisioned, with women, as he foresaw, occupying a place in thought and in action, which is unique and decisive. The new Feminism 1.0 was building foundations, crafting theological, philosophical, and legal arguments, marshaling sociological data, laying the groundwork in the scholarly literature. But I think the women and men in this inspired conference, with yet more foundations laid and distinctions made, are ready to bring the new feminism beyond the walls of the church and dusty law reviews, right into the culture. We're now ready to offer a positive vision for women and men today in the family and education and law and other arenas, the positive affirmative vision our world so desperately needs. But to have the kind of impact I think we're now ready to have, to challenge, contest, and attract women away from the anti-woman beast that calls itself feminism today, the new Feminism 2.0 must really be new. New in the way that God makes us new each and every day, through sanctifying graces won by prayer, the sacraments, and sacrificially conforming our lives to Christ's own likeness. As Helen says, this is not our work to do, but his. And that has got to be if not the key point we all take home with us from this time together. If it is not of God, then let it be destroyed. Now, in the 18 minutes or so I have remaining, I want to scrutinize that second word of the new feminism. I want to ask whether it's accurate to call our Christian challenge to modern feminism itself feminist. And to that question, I'm going to offer a resounding yes, even as I well recognize how very polarizing the F word has become. And we're going to hash it out in the next panel. So as it turns out, the new feminism, based on the radical idea, as Helen put it so well, that females are image of God in the world in a way that men are not, echoes very deeply the account offered by the earliest women's advocates in our very own country. Feminism, which I want to define this morning as the intervention into history here and again and with real steam in the mid-19th century, is the view that understands women as full human persons, another I in the common humanity, as JP2 put it, whose awesome capacity for maternity does not make her a natural inferior, wanting in reason and capacity for virtue, meant for silence, subjection, sexual pleasure, a vessel for reproduction. As I think we've seen in this conference, the very best foundation for correcting this anti woman view that is a legacy of the fall is the Imago Dei. And that is exactly what the earliest women's rights advocates believed too. Unfortunately, the religiously inspired arguments of the leading advocates of the late 18th and early 19th centuries were for a long time memory hold in the academy. You can kind of guess why. Finally emerging with some solid scholarship beginning in the 1990s. And so these key figures of American history have been lost to feminist history as well. So I think it's time we recover these great religious women in the American story to assist us in the edification of our daughters, to inspire a new vision of women's education, and to offer a real foundation for women's rights, to build a bridge outward from the church to positively engage the world, as Christian women have done in so many eras before, as Bronwyn, I think, helped us see. In these early women's advocates, we find a real pride in being a woman, which is what one should want from their feminism, I think. But we also find a call to be and to form others to be the most excellent women we can be. So I want to show in these next few minutes that JP2 was not courting scandal when he called himself a feminist pope in a room full of Catholic scholars. Not because he changed perennial teachings, no, not at all, but because he took up the challenge posed by feminism, by claims of women's equality and freedom, and he tested feminism, just as a good Catholic does, separating the wheat from the chaff. And in doing so, he called what was true in feminist arguments true, and he called what was false, false. And he thereby deepened our understanding of perennial Christian teaching that from the moment Christianity broke into misogynist pagan cultures, edified women and children, and ennobled sex and marriage. In sifting through feminist claims, he followed St. Augustine's wise counsel. Let every good and true Christian understand that wherever truth may be found, it belongs to the master. So as I detail in a very long essay commissioned by the Heritage Foundation, which I would commend to you all, and explore in a lengthy lecture at Benedictine College, now on the Thomistic Institute podcast, the 19th century women's rights advocates in our country, like JP2, 150 years later, made strong appeals to the Imago Dei and Genesis and the divinely ordained natural law, to the virtues of men and of marriage, to the inherent dignity of children born and unborn, to a single high standard of chaste sexual norms, and to the distinctive goods and shared responsibilities of motherhood and fatherhood. Though there were internal philosophical disagreements that grew as the first wave of feminism wore on, the antebellum movement spoke in one voice about women's distinctive familial responsibilities and the God-given natural rights that enabled their fulfillment. Modern, women-erasing, abortion-obsessed, feminist ideology is not that movement's legitimate heir. As Angela mentioned on Wednesday, this 19th century movement rose up in direct response to the Industrial Revolution as factories drew men and then poorer women out of family farms and shops to earn wages. The existential interdependency and common interests of husband and wife as they labored together in the productive agrarian household for centuries. Think Little House on the Prairie, right, Charlotte? We're reading that right now. And the highly skilled, Charlotte's my daughter, sorry if you didn't get that. And the highly skilled labor of both Ma and Pa. Think of both of their labors. Or read a book about the real agency of medieval women. All this had begun to fray in the new liberal economy, even as much traditional housework was displaced by the era's new machines. But in the early movement in our country, it was also inspired by the Second Great Awakening in the early 19th century. Middle-class Christian women whose attendance at church was far more prevalent in that era than men's became inspired to speak out against the social upheaval and economic precarity that industrialization had inflicted upon women and children on the margins of society. They organized themselves and also objected publicly and vocally and loudly to slavery, child labor, illiteracy, domestic abuse, male intemperance with alcohol, marital rape, coverture marriage, and the legal and societal factors, that is the sexual double standard, that contributed to growing rates of prostitution, infanticide, and abortion, referring to the last variously as child murder, the highest crime in the calendar, the crying sin of the age, and a degradation of the medical profession. Well, as these women began to speak out, some men began to denounce their public advocacy as unnatural and unwomanly, arguing that the Bible had called them to silent subjection and purely domestic roles. And this Christian denunciation of fellow Christians inspired the great abolitionist Sarah Grimke to turn to Genesis and to pen her famous letters on the equality of the sexes in 1838. In the first influential text of the 19th century feminism, Grimke translates Genesis from the original Hebrew. She reveals, much as J.P. Wood in his reflections on Genesis, how God first makes man in his own image, which she writes is, quote, a generic term including man and woman, some of which we heard from Deborah and Angela. Echoing St. Augustine and prefiguring J.P. she writes, quote, dominion was given to both over every other creature, but not over each other. They were entrusted to rule creation together in harmony and love. And then in Genesis 2, we hear how God makes the woman as a suitable companion to man. She was a helpmate, different from lower animals because, Grimke says, woman was, quote, in all respects his equal, one who is like him as a free agent, gifted with intellect and endowed with immortality, a moral and responsible being. Then, turning to Genesis 3, Grimke argues that, quote, perverted translations of he will rule over you had falsely, quote, converted a prediction to Eve into a command to Adam. The fall, she said, brought on a struggle for dominion, condemning women to an undignified rule at the hands of dominating men. Remember the tyranny that I read Cardinal Newman writing of? But this, Grimke argued, was not the reciprocal companionship of equals that God had originally intended. The lesson Grimke draws from her translation of Genesis is that just as the man is individually responsible to God for his talents, so too is the woman. Christ alone is her master, quote, and the glory of God is the end of her creation. As Edith Stein would put the same point a century later, it is sinful theft toward God to give oneself completely to another other than God. Grimke's interpretation of Genesis would be echoed throughout the antebellum movement and beyond. Women gathered at the first national women's rights conventions in the early 1850s likewise grounded women's equal status in the Imago Dei. They declared that man and woman were made for equal companionship and that every mature soul is responsible directly to God. They also followed Grimke's view of the fall. Paulina Davis, another name that has been memory hold, served as the president of the first two national women's rights conventions in 1850 and 1851. She collected speeches into the aptly named publication, Woman's Rights, commensurate with her capacities and obligations, because that's how they viewed women's rights. Grimke, Davis stated that the fall had, quote, inverted the order of things, human things. Women became the victim of suffering and bondage, man became her master and swallowed up her existence into his. Calling upon the, quote, Messiah, the Prince of Peace, who took the form of a servant, Davis bemoaned how, quote, power, which is properly only the servant of goodness, is everywhere its master. She continued, quote, womanhood, which is chosen to characterize the church made perfect as the bride of the Lamb, is instead everywhere in a state of degradation corresponding inversely to the glory which is yet to be revealed in her, end quote. Echoing Grimke's argument that Genesis 3 included a descriptive prophecy addressed to woman and not a command to man, Antoinette Blackwell, whose name probably rings more of a bell to you, turned the convention to the interpretation of various texts in the New Testament. Blackwell argued that, quote, the submission enjoined upon the wife in the New Testament is not the unrighteous rule predicted in the Old. She said that it was a Christian submission, quote, due also from man toward man and from man toward woman, quoting several scriptural passages, including, yea, all you be subject to one another at the beginning of that Ephesians passage. With regard to the scriptural injunction that in marriage, man is the head of the woman, she responds, true, but only in the sense in which Christ is represented as head of his body, the church. The mystical head and body, or Christ and his church, symbolizes oneness, union. Still quoting, Christ so loved the church, he gave himself up for her. So men ought to love their wives. Then the rule which grew out of sin will cease with the sin. This, of course, is JP2's teaching in Mulieris Dignitatem. Lucretia Mott, known in her time to be the beloved leader of the early movement for women's rights in our country, also actually related to Sister Sarah Butler,
No.
which just is so fitting for any of you know her. But anyway, also responded to the challenge that women's advocacy was making them unwomanly and taking them out of their appropriate sphere. In an 1849 speech, which was reprinted in local papers and delivered at the First National Convention, Lucretia Mott explicitly defends both sexual difference and women's responsibility to develop their own capacities. She writes, quote, "We would admit all the difference that our great and beneficent Creator has made in relation of man and woman, nor would we seek to disturb this relation." She points to women's difference from man in nature, configuration, physical strength, concluding, "We are satisfied with nature." But she argues women, like men, have a duty to develop their God given powers and human capacities for the good. Now, Mott was worried, as so many female writers before and after her, that woman's want of a thorough education was leading some to degenerate, quoting her, into a kind of effeminacy, a sentimentality in which she is satisfied to be the mere plaything or toy of society, content with her outward adornings and with the tone of flattery. In this, Mott echoes Mary Wollstonecraft's Vindication of the Rights of Woman quite closely. No surprise, Mott and Grimke were both early American readers of Wollstonecraft's most famous text published 60 years before. Wollstonecraft and Mott precede Edith Stein and Abigail Favale yesterday in their shared concern about female degeneracy. To become a true woman, Mott argues, again echoing Wollstonecraft closely, she quote, must understand her duties, physical, intellectual, and moral, and cultivate her powers as a moral and responsible being. Likewise, Paulina Davis's speech, remember she's the convention president, on the education of females at the first National Convention decried the widespread valorization of a certain kind of female weakness that masqueraded as woman's nature per se. Quoting, "Cultivated for the delights of her affectional nature, the heart is disproportionately developed, and she is made a creature of pure feeling and passionate impulse." She continues, "Intellectual culture of any kind which might abate or stead or balance feeling is held unwomanly, and the sex is enslaved by the disproportionate activity of its own distinguishing traits." Notice here, enslaved not by men, but by lack of integral development of herself as a mature, fully mature woman. The overstrength of the heart, Davis concludes, is exaggerated by the weakness of the head. Listen now to Edith Stein and her essays on woman. Quote, "The one-sidedness to which by nature the woman inclines is particularly dangerous." She says unilateral emotional development. Where discipline of mind and will are lacking, emotional life becomes a compulsion without secure direction. Is any of this starting to sound relevant to our time? Indeed, this unilateral emotional development is the chief target of Wollstonecraft's Rights of Woman as well. Throughout her work, Wollstonecraft points to the many risks to women who forego their own moral and intellectual development to be merely pleasing to men. Now, Wollstonecraft well regards, quote, "the care of children in their infancy to be one of the grand duties annexed to the female character by nature." Grand duties. But she worries that the natural and noble obligations of mothers to care for their young children won't overpower corrupt social conventions that tempt women to more superficial pleasures. It's only by placing oneself in right relationship with God and developing their rational and moral faculties, Wollstonecraft thinks, will women live according to their own high dignity and come to understand how important their work is as daughters, sisters, friends, wives, mothers, and citizens. To carry out the hard work of cultivating virtue in children and carrying out their other obligations in the community, women must learn to be strong, faithful, and benevolent, fixated not on appearances and consumed with how to please, but rather knowing how to prepare their children and themselves for eternity. Wollstonecraft, Davis, uh, uh, Wollstonecraft, Mott, Davis, Stein, and our own sister Anne want by education, and as Stein said, objective work, to protect women from the characteristic vices to which they are tempted, in order to call them to the full integration of themselves as human persons, as mature women. What a vision for women's education today. I can tell you, as a classical school founder and also a trustee of a stellar girls' school outside of Boston, whose head of school and a couple faculty are here this week, I for one am personally deeply invested in this essential educational work of our day. So, just as these women bemoan a degeneracy of femininity, slavish dependency, and moral weakness, as distinctive from true, mature, responsible, strong womanhood, they also bemoan faux or tyrannical masculinity as distinct from true, mature, responsible manhood. Neither degeneracy is from God. Both are to be resisted and transformed to uphold a true vision of human integration for both men and women. At a time when both the left and our right in our country want to flatten concepts of masculine and feminine nature to their very worst qualities, it is Christianity that understands our complexity as created, fallen, and redeemed. It is therefore only Christianity, it seems to me, that is capable of bringing us out of the growing gender polarization of our time, but only if our Christian witness and our lives are true to the incredible kaleidoscopic panorama of what it is to live as a fully integrated, virtuous man or woman. Just look at the deep integration of the saints. Thank you.